Our last app was focused in learning more about the styling and building of basic React components. For our next application, we're going to focus on something that is required by nearly every single mobile app out there: authentication, or the process of signing in and signing out users to your application. We'll be wiring up authentication using the popular data service Firebase, which we'll use later on for some other interesting apps as well. So given that this is a new application, we are going to want to generate a new React Native project as well. So at my terminal, inside of my kind of general project directory here, so I've got my albums project right here, I'm going to generate a new project by using the React Native CLI. So if you recall, React-native init, and then I'm going to call this project auth. So this is going to start up our new project and install dependencies. It's definitely going to take a little bit. So let's talk a little bit more about the app that we're going to build and just kind of let this installation run. So let's check out a diagram of what we're going to be making. All right, here we go. So this is a mock-up of the app that we're going to be making. We're going to very purposefully keep it pretty limited in scope. So we're just going to be signing a user in and allowing them to sign out. So when our app first starts up, we're going to be on this left-hand kind of state over here. The user will be prompted with a sign-in form that will ask them for their email and password. After they press the login button right here, we'll then consider them to be like signed in or logged in, at which point in time they'll see the screen on the right-hand side. So again, when a user is signed in, they won't have too much to do. They're just going to be able to sign out. We're just going to keep this the absolute basics of authentication for now. Now there's going to be one interesting aspect of this flow. You'll notice that we've only got kind of this sign in screen right here, and there's nothing about sign up, right? There's no ability to create an account. So what we're going to do to keep the lowest amount of friction for getting users signed up to our application, we're going to just show them login screen. And if they try to sign in with an email address that we've never seen before, we're going to assume that they're trying to create an account, and we'll just create an account for them. So we're going to have this kind of dual purpose login and sign up screen all in one right here. Before ever starting an app, I like to always have a good idea of the different components I'll need to create and also figure out what the biggest challenges of the app will be. So let's do that right now. So for this application, I think that we're going to be able to reuse a lot of the components that we just made. So we'll have a header component, we'll have a card with some card sections, and then a button to actually do the login. So I'm kind of thinking that perhaps the only component that we might need to make will be this login form component. And the purpose of the login form will be just to hold the sign up fields and the button and all that kind of good stuff. As far as the challenges in this app, we're definitely going to have quite a few. So we need to figure out how to use Firebase to authenticate a user or an application. That means we're going to sign up for the Firebase service and enable authentication and install the library to our project. Speaking of Firebase, especially as a library, once we install it, we're going to need to figure out how to integrate it into React. So Firebase did have a React integration library called React Fire, but it's not very well maintained and not really kind of up to date with React in general. So also our next challenge will be for the login form itself. We need to figure out how to handle user input. So this is going to be like a typable field right here that a user should be able to press on and then enter some input. So we need to figure out how to handle input. Also closely related to input, we need to figure out how to validate whatever data the user enters. So if the user enters an email right here that does not exist, or excuse me, if they enter an email and password combination that is incorrect, we should give them a nice big error message to display. Finally, to make a usable application, we always want to give a reasonable amount of feedback to our users. So in this context, we want to make sure that whenever we are attempting to log a user in, like so when they type in the email and password and then click login, we should show a spinner to let the user know that we are attempting to verify their email and password so that they know that we're actually doing something. So definitely a lot of challenges with this app. Deceptively, it looks like there's not a lot going on here, but trust me, like we're going to cover a lot of content just to get this this sign up form put together. So let's continue the next section and start working on this application. In the last section, we installed dependencies for our new project and spoke about some features of the app that we're going to build. Now that our project is all ready to go, I'm going to start up my code editor inside the auth directory. And I'm also going to open up my simulator. Now I've already taken the liberty of starting my simulator up. You'll see it right here. It's already running. I encourage you to pause the video right now. Remember, you can start up your simulator by running the command react-native run iOS or run Android if you are on Android. So let it do its thing and start up the simulator or emulator. All right, if you're still here, I'm going to assume that you have your simulator running, so let's keep going. Inside my code editor, I'll notice all the same files and folders that we had on the last app that we generated. So we still have the Android and iOS folders, we've got the node modules directory, we've got a bunch of configuration stuff, and then we've also got our root file, the index.js file. Now, one thing that you might notice about this default React Native project is that it doesn't really give us a lot of project structure. In other words, let's imagine that at some point in time, if we are working with a ton of different components, there's not really any clear location on where we should stuff all those components or where we should really place them inside of our application. So I'm going to suggest that maybe we should create a new folder to house all the different components that you and I need to create for this project. So I'm going to do that right now. Inside my auth directory, I'm going to make a new folder called src. And we're going to say that we are going to put all of the custom code that we write for our application inside the src directory. The only thing that's going to stay outside will be the index.js file, because React Native requires there to be an index.js file in our root project directory in order to start up correctly. Now you will notice when we first generated our project, there is a default component that is made for us, and is placed inside this app.js file. So by default, the index.js file imports that app and then attempts to show it on the screen. So I don't really want to make use of this default app.js file. I'm going to delete it, and we're going to make our own, but this time we're going to place it inside of the src directory. So inside the src directory, I'm going to make a new file, and I'm going to call it app.js as well. Inside of here, we're going to place some import statements and a new component to generate some content that we can show on the screen. So just a very simple little component, something to just get us started. Inside the app.js file, I'm going to first start off by importing React and component from the React library. And I'll also import the view and text tags from React Native as well. Then I will create my new app component. I'll say class app extends component. I'll define my render method inside of here. And inside there, I will return a little bit of just boilerplate tags. So I'll put a view, and inside the view, I'll place a text tag. And we'll say that this text tag says something like an app, whatever you want it to say. And then don't forget, at the bottom of the file, we need to export this component as well. So we'll export default app. Okay, the last thing we have to do is make sure that we import the correct file into our index.js file. So back inside of index.js, right now, this file is assuming that it can import the app component from an app file in the same root directory. And that's not the case anymore. We are now placing this app component inside of the src directory. So I'm going to fix up the path here by saying src/app, like so. We should now be able to save this file and then refresh our simulator, and we should see that new content appear on the screen. All right, so it is up here at the top left. We do have a little bit of an overlap issue, but it looks like it definitely works. So let's keep going in the next video. We've now centralized all the code for our application inside of our app.js file. So again, this has the benefit of allowing us to test against an Android or iOS build without having to worry about any platform-specific configuration. Thinking back to the mockups that we looked at for this app, let's pull those up real quick. There we go. So thinking back to these mockups, we definitely had a lot of components in here, such as the header, the buttons, and the card views. Rather than rebuild all these from scratch, I'm going to suggest that we just copy paste these files over from our last project. After all, that is the goal of reusable components. We want to be able to avoid having to remake the same elements over and over again. And I don't know about you, but if I had to make the header a second time inside this course, I wouldn't be terribly happy. But anyways, there's some really fancy ways to import code over or kind of share it between projects. And we certainly could, but we're going to keep things here just for the sake of this course. Very simple, very straightforward. We're just going to copy paste a few files. That's all we're going to do. So I want to copy paste a handful of components out of my previous project, our albums project, and then just drop them directly into this auth project. Okay, so not a lot of magic here. We're just going to do the copy paste. So inside my components directory, or excuse me, inside my source directory, we'll start by making a components folder. So I'll make my components folder like so. And then this time around, I'm going to make another folder inside of here, and I call it common. And the goal here is that any reusable components that I have inside my project, I'm going to place them all inside this common directory. And you'll see why in just a minute. This is going to be a really nice trick that we're going to use here for our reusable components. Okay, so this common folder right here is where I want to put my reusable components from the last section. So now we'll do a little bit of copy pasting. I'm going to open up my file explorer here, and honestly you can do this copy pasting process however you want. So you can use the terminal, you can use your code editor, however you want to get your files over here is totally fine by me. But for me, just to make everything nice and easy for everyone, I'm going to do it in a very visual fashion by doing the actual dragging and dropping. So let me pull open my React Native project directory. Here we go. There we go. So I've got my components directory from my albums project in one window. And then in my other window, I've got my auth, source, components, common directory. So I'm just going to take my button, my card section, and my header components, and I'm going to just drop them all inside that common directory. And it should be a really fast copy paste over. So now I've got button, card section, and header all inside of that common directory right here. As a quick aside, if you feel as though your 4 components right here, we are going to depend on these pretty heavily. If yours are not working perfectly, you can always hop on the official GitHub repo for this course and just copy paste the code for each of these files directly. And you can just get a nice fresh copy. As a reminder, you can find the link to the GitHub repo in one of the very first sections inside this course. You just hop right on over there, go find these project files and just copy them right into your project directory. Okay, so that's that. Inside, I'm going to pop my code editor back open here, and yep, now I can verify that I've got my 4 components inside the common directory. Okay, so now here's a little trick I mentioned. We know that components like the login form that we're going to create in a little bit, I've only vaguely mentioned the login form, but the login form is going to be the thing that's going to house the actual login form here. We know that it's going to need to require several different components out of that common directory, right? We know that it's definitely going to need the button, it's going to need the card, it's going to need the card section. We're going to need to import quite a few things out of that single directory right there. That means that we would have to stack up a bunch of import statements that all import stuff out of the same directory. And you know what? Having a ton of import statements at the top of your file, it gets a little bit tiresome to read, right? You don't want to see, whenever you open a file, something like that, right? It just gets old really quickly. So I'm going to suggest a little bit of a workaround, a nice little trick that's going to dramatically simplify the number of import statements that we have to use inside this application. So I'm going to pull a diagram up really quick of exactly how this is going to work. All right, so here's the strategy here. Inside of our common folder, we're going to create a new file called index.js. So don't confuse this with the top level index iOS.js and index Android.js files. This is a completely separate one, all right, completely separate index.js file. So inside of index.js, we will import the header, the button, the card section, and the card, and then we will immediately export them. Then when any other component that wants to use any of these files, if I have a single component that wants to get access to the header and the button, we will be able to import both those components from just components/common. Take note that the import string here in the diagram actually is correct. I have not actually specified a file here, but whenever we have a file called index.js inside of a directory, and I'm suggesting that we do, if we try to import from that directory without specifying a file, it will by default pick up that index file. Okay, so basically if we leave off any very particular file, we will get a default of index.js come back to us. As a quick aside, that's why you generally see the file name of index floating all over the place in really large or established React projects. Okay, so let's give this a shot. It really shouldn't be too bad. In my common folder, I'm going to make a new file called index.js. Then inside of here, we are going to we're going to import and export each of these other components in just a single line here. So we're going to use a little bit of a trick to do that. Normally, we might do something like, say, import button from button and then export button, right? Instead, we're going to do this entire step all in one line. To do so, we will write export star, that's Shift 8 on your keyboard, from button. So in a single line here, this imports and exports the button component. So then we will repeat the same step for our other files as well. Our card section. And we're going to, one thing that we made a mistake on much earlier, I used a lowercase on the header here. I'm going to fix that issue right now. So very important, I'm going to fix the header issue. I have capital H right here. I'm going to fix up my header file by just renaming it to use a capital H as well. So capital H header. Now everything across the board is nice and consistent. So again, this statement here, these statements, each of these, is essentially a pass-through. It can be read as take everything from the button file and export it from this one, like export it from index.js. One last thing though, you'll notice that each of these, I've got an ESLint error here, it says no named exports found in module button. So the one downside to this approach that I'm taking right here is if I want to use this pattern, I cannot use the default keyword inside of each of these files. So I'm inside of my button component right now. If I want to use this approach, I cannot use the default keyword. Instead, I have to export an object with a key of button. So I would have to do something like this. So I want to export an object with a key of button and a value of the actual component, which is button. And of course, you'll also notice that because I've got a key and a value that are identical, I can use a little bit of ES6 to condense this down to just button, like so. So again, the one twist here, if you're using this export star syntax, we have to make sure that we just export something without that default keyword. And when I save here, you'll see that that error now falls off. So we're going to repeat the same process in the other files as well. Inside of my card component, I will go down to the bottom. I'm going to take off the default keyword and wrap it with curly braces. I'm going to do the same thing for my card section. Replace it with curly braces, and then the same thing with the header as well. Okay, so now all four of my reusable components have a single export statement at the bottom. Here's my export, and my export. And now my index.js file is all happy. So no errors from ESLint. If you still have something or some errors from ESLint, keep in mind that ESLint, just to hit Command S to save the file and you should see those errors drop off. If ESLint is still complaining, I would encourage you to just close the index file and open it back up and you should be good to go. Okay, so one last step here. I want to just make sure that everything is working as we expect. So I'm going to flip back over to our app component and I want to test out this new import strategy. So at the very top, I will import header from components common. And notice that I do not have to specify that index file. If I just specify a directory, by default, it will go to the index.js file. In addition, I only want to get the header out of here, so I'm going to destructure header out of that index file. Then inside of our component, I'll locate the header and I'll give it a header text of authentication, like so. Cool. Let's go ahead and give this a test out in our simulator. So I'll flip over, refresh, and hot dog. It all worked out, hooray! So again, this whole pattern right here, I know that the refactor was a little bit of a pain, but the entire idea behind it was that we can now put all of our reusable components inside that common directory and then just have one single import statement to get access to all of them. So definitely makes life a little bit easier. Let's continue in the next section and get started with Firebase. In the last section, we set up some infrastructure for our reusable components to be able to import them more easily. So with a single line, all the components we need, at least for the common ones. We'll now continue by getting set up with Firebase. But before we do, let's answer that nagging question. What in the world is Firebase? What is it going to do for us? So we're going to explain Firebase with this amazingly simple diagram right here, because what Firebase really does is amazingly simple. Firebase can be thought of as an online database that will connect directly to our app. As we develop or publish our app, we can connect to this online data store and be automatically notified of any changes to our data by other users of our application. So whenever some amount of data changes, we can decide to update our different components and present that new information to our users. Firebase is not only about moving data between Firebase, the database, and our application though. It can also be used for analytics, file storage, or the feature that we're interested in right now, authentication. So I can talk all day about Firebase, but it is certainly one of those concepts where you just have to walk through it yourself. So let's sign up for an account and get started. First, I'll open up my browser and pop open a new tab. And I'm going to go to firebase.google.com. Now I'm going to assume that you've already got a Google account, like general Gmail or just something like that account. I'm going to assume that you have one. If you do not have a Google account, you'll need to create one right now. And you can do so by clicking sign up here on the top right. In my case, I've already got a Google account and I've already hooked it up with Firebase. But again, if you've never hooked up with Firebase and you are signed into Google, there should be a link up here that basically just says, yeah, I want to sign up for Firebase. That's it. So once you sign up for Firebase, you'll get dumped at the Firebase console. So here's the console right here. Your console might look a little bit different. You might see some more text up here on the top left, but basically one way or the other, you want to find a button that says Create New Project. And if you just created an account, I believe it's going to be like right over here on the left-hand side. So all we're going to do is create a new project. That's the goal here. So I'll click Create New Project. And I've already got a project called Auth that I made when I was first developing this application. You can call it whatever you would like. I'm going to call my project just Authentication, just to have something different than Auth. And I will create my project. This is going to take a little bit of time for everything to get set up, but after creating the project, it'll automatically take us to our project dashboard. So the first thing I want to tell you about this project dashboard is that it's set up for a lot of the different features that are included with Firebase. So we've got working with analytics, working with authentication, which is what we care about, database data, storage, hosting, blah, 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 all that kind of good stuff. The other thing I want to mention to you about using Firebase specifically with React Native, all over the place in the documentation, you're going to see stuff that says, add Firebase to your iOS app, your Android app, or your web app. And of course, React Native doesn't quite fit into any of these single categories. We're going to be using add Firebase to your web app because what this add Firebase to your web app can really be read as is just add Firebase to a JavaScript application. And that is what, oops, not yet. All right, that's fine. And that's basically what we're really doing here. We are adding Firebase to a JavaScript application. All right, so one last thing we need to do here to get set up for our application. On the left-hand side, we're going to find that Auth section and click it. And then immediately we get some setup here, and we're going to set up a sign-in method. So I'm going to click set up a sign-in method, and these are all the different providers that we can use with Firebase. Now, unfortunately, you'll see Google, Facebook, Twitter, GitHub. It would be awesome to do OAuth with React Native, but right now, unfortunately, Firebase does not have great support for using OAuth providers with React Native. So for us right now, we're just going to be making use of email and password as a authentication mechanism. So I'll click on email and password, and I know this is really small, by the way, but their zoom doesn't do the greatest. Maybe that's better. Okay, so I clicked on email and password, and we are going to specifically say, yep, I want to enable this. Please turn on email and password authentication. So then we'll save, and that's pretty much it. We just enabled email and password as an authentication mechanism. Let's now continue in the next section and get our client set up with Firebase. In the last section, we set up our Firebase account and we enabled email and password for authentication. That's only half the setup though, as we still have to set up the Firebase client library so we can interact with their servers. So we still have to do a little bit setup now, but don't worry, this setup part isn't too bad. It's just more installation of modules. So first thing we're going to do is install the Firebase library as an NPM module. So I'm going to open up my command line. I'm inside of my project directory of auth right now, and I will npm install --save Firebase. So again, this is going to reach out to the npm registry and install Firebase as a dependency. After that, we will be able to set up Firebase inside of our application. Now, when we created our Firebase project, like over in the Firebase console here, when we made this authentication thing, it created a distinct bucket of data for our project that sits on the Firebase servers. So now, in theory, on the Firebase servers, there's some like big folder or bucket where all of our data is going to sit. So to set up our Firebase library locally, we have to tell it exactly what bucket to go reach out and try to get access to on the Firebase servers. Okay, so my Firebase library is done installing, and we are now going to tell it, hey, when you boot up, please try to connect to this very specific bucket of data. That's the goal here. So inside of our app component, we're going to place that initialization code inside of here. We will first import Firebase from Firebase. So this gives us access to the Firebase library. And then we are going to set up some initialization or configuration for it. And we need to think for a second, when's the best time to do setup like that? You know, when's the best time in our application to do that setup? And so I'm going to say, well, maybe the best time to do that setup would be right before this component right here, this app component, gets rendered to the screen of our device. To get a handle or a hook on that, we can use a lifecycle method. So we'll add the lifecycle method, component will mount, and inside of here is where we will do our Firebase initialization. Remember that lifecycle methods are methods that are automatically invoked inside of our component. All we have to do is define the method, and if we define it, it will be automatically called. All right, so last step, we are going to go back over to Firebase, and on the right-hand top side here, you can find a button that says Web Setup. I'm going to click Web Setup, and this gives me a bunch of stuff to copy paste into my application. Note that this is all set up assuming that you're using a web, or like you're in a web environment. So it's got some script tags and all that kind of good stuff. And we're clearly not in a web environment. We're using React Native. So we're going to kind of just copy paste a section out of this. I'm going to grab just this configuration object right here. So just everything from the opening curly brace to the closing curly brace. And then I'm going to copy it. And we'll pull it back over to our component will mount. And inside of here, we'll call Firebase initialize app. And I'm going to paste in that configuration. And I'm also going to make sure I delete the dangling semicolon here. Okay, and the last thing is ESLint really wants to have single quotes, and I am happy to oblige. So I'm just going to replace all these with single quotes like so. Okay, one of the last things, I put that import statement as the last statement. It should really be above any import statements for stuff that we write. That was a mistake on my side. So I'm just going to cut this line and move it above the header import. There we go, much better. Okay, so that's it. That's all we had to do for our Firebase setup. So at this point in time, we have installed the Firebase library, and we gave it a little bit of configuration that told it, hey, we've already got a project set up for you. There's some bucket of data on the Firebase servers that you need to make access to. And this is the configuration that makes that happen. So I think that we are just about all set now to start working on our form. Let's continue on the next section and start working on that sign up form. In the last section, we finished some Firebase setup. We're not going to come back to Firebase for a little bit. Instead, we're going to focus on putting together our sign-in form with some really good styling for now. And then we'll come back to Firebase and actually wrap up the authentication piece. So one of the first considerations that we need to make for this sign-up form is whether or not we should create a new component to house the form itself, or whether or not we should just place the form directly inside this app component. So I'm talking about like literally placing a text input tag directly inside this component. I'm going to suggest that we create a separate component, and here's why. The sign-in form should only be visible for a portion of the time inside our app. Sometimes we'll show the form, right? Like when the user first starts the app up, but other times we won't. So when a user successfully signs in, and it's going to be easier to hide it if we put the form into a separate component. So with that in mind, I'm going to create a new file inside of my components directory, not inside of common, just inside of components, called login form. So login form, its sole purpose is going to be to house everything having to do with entering an email, entering a password, and then trying to sign the user in. So inside this file, let's get started with a little bit of boilerplate. I am going to make this a class-based component for reasons that we'll talk about in just a little bit. So we'll import React and component from React, and then just view for right now from React Native. Then we'll create our component class of login form. I'm going to make sure I've got component spelt correctly, and add my render method from which we'll return a single view tag for right now. Then at the bottom, we can export default login form. Okay, so there's the boilerplate right now. I'm hoping that at some point in time, getting this boilerplate together is going to become second nature, because if it feels like we write it a lot, yep, that's absolutely correct. We definitely write this thing a lot, this boilerplate out. All right, as a quick reminder, this login form, here's a diagram for it. We need to have that kind of the card section component, and definitely the button component as well. So I think that our next step will be to place our reusable components, or at least import them, and then kind of scaffold out what we want the login form to look like. We're going to need one card, and I think it's going to contain 3 card sections. One for email, one for password, and one for the login button. So let's get started with that now. At the very top, we will import our button, card, and card section from the common directory. And notice that I'm saying in the current directory, find the common folder, because this login form is already inside the components directory. Notice how this is a lot nicer import statement than if we had 3 separate import statements all coming from the common folder. So again, I really like this kind of pattern here, this kind of approach. Now we'll add just kind of a little bit of scaffolding of what the different cards and card section areas should be. So I'm going to take out the view tag for right now, and I'll replace it with a card tag. So that's going to give us that kind of nice looking wrapper that has some nice shadow on it, has some margin on the left and right hand sides, just something that looks nice. And inside of here, we'll make our 3 separate card sections. So card section 1, and for right now I'm just going to use self-closing tags because I don't have anything to put inside the first 2 just yet. And then for the last one, this is going to be the card section that's going to house the button. And we could probably create that button right now because we already know what text it's going to require. So I'm just going to put in login like so. So we've got card, 3 card sections, and the last card section has a button tag inside of it. Finally, we need to make sure that this component actually gets shown inside of our app. So I'm going to flip back to our app component, import this form, and show it. So up at the top, we will import login form from components login form like so. And then we're going to show it inside of our application. So I've got my view tag, I've got my header tag. I probably don't need the text anymore. It was really just there to get us started. So I'm going to take out the text tag and replace it with an instance of the login form like so. All right. Now, of course, as I mentioned earlier, we probably don't want to show the login form 100% of the time, but we will just use this shortcut for now, and we'll come back later and figure out how we're going to toggle whether or not the login form is visible. Okay, time to see if everything worked out. I'm going to flip back over to simulator, refresh, and see how we're doing. The first time we import stuff always takes a while for it to transpile, especially since my laptop is not the newest one in the world. So we'll just I'm never giving up. I'm just gonna let the thing go. While that is running though, I do need to do a little bit of cleanup. I've still got the unused text tag, which we just deleted. So I'm just gonna take that out just for good housekeeping. And there we go. All right, so much better. I've got 1 card section, 2 card section, and the third one here. And the third one presently just houses the login button, which if we press doesn't do anything just yet. So let's continue the next section and figure out exactly what we're going to place inside of these card sections.